Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In northern Gaza, Israeli soldiers have launched a full-scale attack on Jabalia. Details are still emerging on what a Gaza civil defense spokesperson described as a major massacre, with more than 150 people killed or injured as Israeli forces took down a dozen residential buildings. Late Thursday, Israeli forces stormed Kamal Adwan Hospital, expelling patients and staff after earlier surrounding and shelling what was essentially the last hospital left standing in the area. Soldiers carried out mass arrests. Doctors say babies and children have died after being cut off from their oxygen supplies. Kamal Adwan's director, Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, says the situation is catastrophic, that there is nowhere patients in northern Gaza can go for treatment. After headlines, we'll go to northern Gaza to speak with the acting director of Kamal Adwan, Mohammed Salha. Israeli attacks in the southern Gaza Strip continue as well. In Khan Yunis, at least 38 people were killed by Israel, including 14 children from the same family. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he expects Gaza ceasefire talks to resume in the coming days in Doha. In Lebanon, an Israeli strike killed 3 journalists as they slept in a guest house in the southern town of Hasbaya. Israel did not issue any evacuation orders for the area before the strike. The victims were Al Mayadeen journalist Ghassan Najjar and Mohammed Reda and Wissam Qasim of Al-Manar TV. Al Mayadeen reporter Abbas Sabah addressed his colleague's killing earlier today from Lebanon.
Israel targeted journalists in Hasbaya, knowing that the area is known for the gathering of journalists. This enemy that looks for civilian targets after it's drained its military targets and lost in the field is now targeting journalists.
Lebanon's information minister called the attack a war crime. The official death toll from Israel's assault on Lebanon is nearing 2,600. In Russia, 36 world leaders have wrapped up a summit of the BRICS alliance led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with a pledge to add 13 new partners. The newly expanded BRICS will include Algeria, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Turkey, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. Venezuela failed in its bid to join BRICS after Brazil vetoed its admission. The Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, has said he would not accept the result of July's election in which Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro claimed to narrowly win re-election. We'll have more on the BRICS summit later in the broadcast. In the Philippines, tropical storm Trami has killed at least 26 people after dumping torrential rains across the main island of Luzon. At least 14 of the deaths were in Batangas province.
I was panicking. I was looking for my child. He was missing. When I got here, all the houses were gone. Everything was buried in mud. There was also 2 residents looking for their family under the mud. The United Nations Environment Program warns without dramatic cuts to greenhouse gas emissions, the world will face an inevitable and catastrophic temperature rise of 3.1 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a stark warning as he announced the findings.
The message of today's emissions gap report is clear. We are teetering on a planetary tightrope. Either leaders bridge the emissions gap, or we plunge headlong into climate disaster, with the poorest and most vulnerable suffering the most.
King Charles has joined leaders of 56 nations, most of them former British colonies, for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which opened today in Samoa's capital, Apia. 24 of the Commonwealth's nations are small island states, making the threat of rising seas and worsening tropical storms a priority at this year's summit. A new report finds the Commonwealth's 3 wealthiest members, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, are responsible for 60% of its greenhouse gas emissions, even though they comprise just 6% of the Commonwealth's population. Ahead of the talks, Tuvalu's prime minister called on nations to back a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty.
To put it plainly, it is a death sentence, not phrases that I use lightly, for us, Tuvalu, if larger nations continue to increase their emission levels. A fossil fuel treaty will be a global mechanism essential for managing a just transition away from coal, oil, and gas.
Meanwhile, King Charles has refused calls by African and Caribbean nations to pay reparations and make amends for Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade. In remarks opening the Commonwealth Summit, Charles stopped short of an apology. He instead acknowledged painful aspects of Britain's past. In Mozambique, protests broke out after Daniel Chapo of the ruling Frelimo party was announced the winner of a disputed presidential election Thursday.
I don't believe that Frelimo won. I think Frelimo did what they always do. What's happening today is people are suffering.
Chapo's biggest rival, Venancio Mondlane, has called on supporters to keep taking to the streets in protest. Earlier this week, police deployed tear gas and fired on demonstrators who rallied after the murder of Mondlane's lawyer and a party official. Issues in this year's election included Mozambique's debt crisis, corruption, climate change-driven disasters, and a violent insurgency in the north of the country. Here in New York, a group of protesters gathered outside the Dominican consulate in the Bronx Thursday to denounce the mass deportation of Haitians by the Dominican Republic. Earlier this month, the Dominican president, Luis Abinader, announced a campaign to expel up to 10,000 Haitians a week, citing an excess of immigrants. In the last 3 weeks, over 27,000 people have been deported to Haiti. This is Dr. Saudi Garcia. The expulsions come as the UN says more than 10,000 Haitians were internally displaced over the past week after fleeing gang attacks around the capital, Port-au-Prince. In campaign news, Donald Trump rallied in Tempe, Arizona Thursday, where he unleashed another torrent of anti-immigrant hate speech.
Kamala's migrant invasion, given to us through gross incompetence, disqualifies her from even thinking about being president. And we're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world. That's what's happened.
Trump deployed a similar hate-filled rhetoric at another Thursday rally in Las Vegas, where he also claimed he was leading by a lot in swing states, even as most polls put him neck and neck with Kamala Harris. Meanwhile, in Clarkston, Georgia, Kamala Harris shared the stage with Barack Obama for the first time during her campaign, as she touted her support for abortion rights, her proposals to lift up the middle class. The star-studded rally included Spike Lee, Samuel L. Jackson, and Tyler Perry in a performance from Bruce Springsteen. As of Wednesday, nearly 2 million Georgian voters cast early ballots, a record for Georgia. The immigrant justice group Al Otro Lado celebrated a major legal victory this week after a federal appeals court ruled in favor of its class action lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security. The case challenged the illegal practice by Customs and Border Protection of turning away asylum seekers at U.S. ports of entry without due process, forcing them to wait in border cities, often in extremely dangerous and precarious situations. And President Biden is visiting the Gila Crossing Community School in Arizona today, where he'll issue a formal apology for government-run Native American boarding schools, which separated indigenous families and sought to eliminate Native cultures. The U.S. government operated hundreds of these schools from 1819 to 1969. Where children reported severe physical and psychological abuse. An Interior Department investigation this year found nearly 1,000 children died while at the schools. Biden will be accompanied by Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, the first ever Native American cabinet secretary. Haaland is a member of the Pueblo of Laguna. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.